There are moments in life that arrive quietly, without warning, and without fanfare. Moments that don't announce themselves as turning points. They simply happen. And it's only later, when you look back from a distance, that you realize everything changed in that single, ordinary afternoon. This is one of those stories. His name was Daniel Mercer, 51 years old. Salt and pepper hair that he kept neatly combed every morning out of habit, even on the days he had nowhere important to be. Brown eyes behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that his daughter had picked out for him at the optometrist 3 years ago. A quiet man. A steady man. The kind of man who always arrived 5 minutes early, kept his desk organized, remembered birthdays, and never once in 22 years called in sick unless he truly couldn't stand up straight. He wore plaid shirts to work. Not because he didn't own nicer things, but because he was comfortable, and comfort mattered to Daniel in a way that only people who have worked very hard for a very long time come to truly understand. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He simply showed up every single day and did the work that needed to be done. He had started at Harrington Financial Services the year his youngest son was born. He remembered bringing in a little blue balloon to the office that day, tying it to his monitor, and his colleagues laughing warmly around him. That memory had never left him. 22 years of mornings. 22 years of coffee from the same break room pot. 22 years of knowing where every file was, understanding every client relationship, navigating every internal process with the quiet confidence of a man who had built something meaningful through patience and dedication alone. He was not the most important person in the room. He was never the one giving speeches at company events or being featured in the quarterly newsletter. But if you needed something done correctly, if you needed something done with care, you went to Daniel Mercer. Everyone knew that. Even the people who didn't say it out loud. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in early November. The sky was that particular shade of grey that settles over Midwestern cities in the fall, the kind that isn't quite threatening rain but holds no promise of sunlight either. Daniel had driven in as always, parked in his usual spot toward the back of the lot out of consideration for the younger staff who sometimes ran late, and walked through the front doors carrying a thermos of coffee his wife Margaret had made for him that morning. He noticed the closed blinds in the conference room on his way past. He noticed that 2 of the senior managers weren't at their desks yet, which was unusual for that hour. He noticed a small cluster of administrative staff speaking in low voices near the copy machine, and when he nodded a good morning in their direction, they smiled back in a way that was just slightly too careful. Daniel set down his thermos, straightened a few papers on his desk out of habit, and waited. At 9:15, his manager called him in. His manager's name was Brandon Cole, 34 years old. Dark hair, always meticulously styled. A navy suit that fit him precisely. With a matching tie he had a habit of adjusting even when it didn't need adjusting. Brandon was the kind of young executive who had moved quickly through the company, propelled by ambition and a confident manner that upper management found reassuring. He wasn't unkind, exactly. But he was efficient in the way that sometimes forgets there are people inside the numbers. He was already standing when Daniel walked in. There was a cardboard box on the table. Daniel looked at the box, then at Brandon, then back at the box. And he understood. Brandon spoke in practiced, measured sentences. Words like restructuring, realignment, difficult decisions made at the regional level. He gestured occasionally with 2 fingers pointing outward, as though emphasizing the reasonableness of what he was saying. He did not look Daniel in the eye for very long. A woman from Human Resources sat quietly to the side with a folder open on her lap. Daniel stood very still throughout all of it. When Brandon finished, Daniel nodded slowly. Once. The way a man nods when he is absorbing something without letting it break him in front of an audience. He asked a few quiet questions. About his final paycheck. About benefits continuation. About the timeline for handing over his files. All practical. All calm. And then he walked back to his desk, alone, and began to pack. A few of his colleagues came by. Some squeezed his shoulder without saying anything, because there are moments when words are simply inadequate. One woman, Patricia, who had worked alongside him for 11 years, stood with him for several minutes and cried quietly into a tissue, which she apologized for, and which Daniel told her gently was completely unnecessary. He took his time. He didn't rush, and he didn't make a scene. He packed the photograph of Margaret from the corner of his desk. The little ceramic mug his granddaughter had painted for him with uneven purple letters that spelled Grandpa. A small potted succulent that had somehow survived on his windowsill for 4 years. a few personal items from his drawer. And then he picked up the box, tucked it under his arm, and walked out of the building he had entered every morning for 22 years. The sky was still grey. His car was still in the far corner of the lot. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time before he started the engine. That evening, Margaret made pot roast because she always made pot roast when something needed comforting, even before she fully understood what needed comforting. She had a quiet intuition about her husband that decades of marriage had refined into something almost preternatural. They sat at the kitchen table together, the way they always had, and Daniel told her what had happened in the simple, direct way that was characteristic of him. No drama. No bitterness. Just the facts, laid out plainly, with long pauses in between. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Well," she said softly, after a moment. "Well," he agreed. They sat like that for a while in the warm light of the kitchen, the smell of dinner around them, the quiet of the house settling in the way it does in the evenings of long marriages. And Daniel felt something that surprised him slightly. Not devastation. Not rage. Something more like weariness. The deep, cellular tiredness of a man who has given a very great deal for a very long time, and who is only now, sitting still, beginning to feel the weight of it. He slept better that night than he expected to. The weeks that followed were strange in the way that sudden stillness is always strange for people who have spent decades in motion. Daniel woke at his usual time every morning. He drank his coffee. He read the news. He went for walks in the neighborhood that he had never had time to properly explore, noticing for the first time the particular maple tree on Greenfield Avenue that turned a color in autumn that he could only describe as magnificent. He wasn't idle. He reached out to former colleagues, updated his resume, which felt surreal after 22 years with the same employer, made some calls, attended a networking lunch that his friend Gerald organized, where he sat across from people half his age and found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation more than he expected. He also spent time with his granddaughter on Friday afternoons while his daughter worked. He read to her. They baked things that didn't always turn out correctly but were always eaten enthusiastically. He taught her how to play checkers with the same patience he had brought to everything else in his life. And slowly, quietly, something in him began to settle. Not resignation. Something more like clarity. The kind that only comes when you stop moving long enough to see where you actually are. He began to understand that 22 years at one company, given willingly and with integrity, was not a failure. It was a life. A good one. And whatever came next would simply be a different chapter of that same life. Not lesser. Just different. It was Gerald who called him in late January. Gerald Whitman had been Daniel's closest professional friend for 15 years. A man of similar age and temperament who had left Harrington Financial several years earlier to take a position with a regional investment group called Cornerstone Capital Partners. He called on a Thursday afternoon while Daniel was raking the last of the season's leaves from the backyard. "I need you to hear me out before you say anything," Gerald said, in the way he always prefaced things he considered important. Daniel set down the rake. What Gerald described was this. Cornerstone Capital Partners had been growing steadily for several years. They had recently secured a significant contract that required expanding their client services division substantially and quickly. The position that needed to be filled was a senior one. Director of Client Relations. A leadership role overseeing a team of 12, managing key institutional accounts, and serving as a primary point of contact for the company's largest partners. Gerald had recommended Daniel without hesitation. "You know this work better than anyone I've ever met," Gerald said simply. "And more importantly, you know how to treat people. That matters more than anyone in a corner office ever wants to admit, but the good ones know it." Daniel stood in the backyard for a long moment with the phone to his ear, watching a single late leaf detach itself from the oak tree at the far end of the yard and float gently down to the frozen ground. "Tell me more," he said. The interview process took 3 weeks. Daniel approached it the way he approached everything. Thoroughly. Calmly. With genuine care rather than performance. He prepared, but not in a way that made him seem unlike himself. He spoke about his 22 years of experience not as a defense but as a simple statement of what he knew and what he had learned. He was honest about what he didn't know and clear about how he would address it. The president of Cornerstone Capital Partners was a woman named Elizabeth Hartley. 60 years old. Sharp, warm, the kind of leader who had built her reputation on surrounding herself with people of genuine character. She had, over the course of her career, developed an almost unfailing instinct for the difference between people who performed well and people who were genuinely good at the work because they cared about it. She knew which kind Daniel was within the first 20 minutes of their conversation. She called him the following Monday morning. He was offered the position. The salary was substantially higher than anything he had earned at Harrington. The title was director. He would have his own office, a team he would be responsible for developing, and the kind of institutional trust that is only extended to people who have genuinely earned it. He called Margaret from the driveway before he came inside. She cried. Just a little. The happy kind. His first day at Cornerstone Capital Partners fell on a Monday in early March. The offices were on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, with windows that looked out over the city in a way that felt quietly generous, as though the view itself was offering something. Daniel arrived 5 minutes early, as he always had. He wore a suit. He had purchased it specifically for this role, a deep charcoal grey that Margaret had approved of with a single nod that carried the full weight of her aesthetic authority. He shook hands with each member of his new team personally, learned their names, asked them genuine questions and listened to the answers with the full attention of someone for whom listening had always been a primary skill rather than a courtesy. He learned the systems, asked questions without embarrassment, brought coffee to the team on his third day without announcement, setting it on the shared table in the morning before most of them had arrived, with a small handwritten note that said simply, "Good morning. Glad to be here." Patricia, his former colleague, texted him that week to ask how it was going. He wrote back, "Better than I expected," which is saying something. It was a Thursday in April when the call came in. Cornerstone had been in discussions with a mid-sized firm about a potential advisory partnership. The firm was called Harrington Financial Services. Daniel sat with that information for a moment when Elizabeth mentioned it in passing during their weekly check-in. He kept his expression professionally neutral in the way that decades of professional life equips you to do. "We'll schedule a preliminary meeting next week," Elizabeth said. "I'd like you to lead it on our end." "Of course," Daniel said. He thought about it on the drive home that evening. He was not, he realized, angry. He had expected to feel something sharper when the name surfaced, but what he actually felt was something quieter and more complex. Something that had more to do with time and perspective than with grievance. He thought about Brandon Cole, and about the box on the conference table, and about the grey November sky. He thought about the maple tree on Greenfield Avenue, about Friday afternoons with his granddaughter and the checkers board, about Margaret's pot roast, about Gerald's phone call, about Elizabeth Hartley's steady, perceptive eyes across the conference table during his interview. He thought about the single leaf detaching from the oak tree in the backyard and floating quietly to the ground. And he understood something that he suspected he had always known but perhaps needed the space to fully feel. Nothing had been done to him. Life had simply moved. The way it always does. The way it always will. With no particular malice and no particular design. It had moved, and he had moved with it, and here he was. In a better place than before. Surrounded by people who valued him. Doing work that mattered. Arriving 5 minutes early, as always. That was enough. That was, in fact, quite a lot. The preliminary meeting took place on a Tuesday morning. The Harrington team arrived at 10 o'clock. 4 of them. Daniel was already in the conference room when they walked in, standing near the windows with a cup of coffee, looking out over the city. He turned when they entered. Brandon Cole was among them. The younger man stopped very briefly when he recognized Daniel. Just briefly. A small hesitation, controlled quickly, but visible to anyone paying attention. Daniel crossed the room and extended his hand. "Brandon," he said warmly. "Good to see you. Thank you for making the trip." Brandon shook his hand. His expression was carefully composed but carried something underneath it that was harder to name. Not quite shame. Something more like a reckoning. The particular discomfort of a person who is suddenly required to see themselves from a different angle. "Daniel," he said. "I didn't realize you were at Cornerstone." "Few months now," Daniel said simply. "Come in, sit down. Can I get anyone coffee?" He said it with complete sincerity. Not because he was performing graciousness. Not because he wanted Brandon to feel a particular way. But because it was who he was. It had always been who he was. And no cardboard box, no November afternoon, no single moment of institutional indifference could change the fundamental character of a man who had spent his entire life choosing to be kind because he genuinely believed it mattered. The meeting went well. Daniel ran it with the same calm competence he had brought to everything else. He was thoughtful. He was fair. He asked good questions and gave clear answers. He represented Cornerstone with exactly the kind of integrity that had led Elizabeth to hire him. Afterward, when the Harrington team had gone, Elizabeth stopped by his office doorway. "Well done," she said simply. Daniel nodded. "Thank you," he said. He called Gerald that evening. "You were right," Daniel told him. "I usually am," Gerald said. "About what specifically?" "About it mattering. How you treat people." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "It always comes around," he said. "Not as punishment. Not as reward. Just as itself. People remember how you made them feel. For a long time." Daniel looked out the window of his study. The spring evening was settling in, the sky finally holding some color after the long gray months of winter. "I remember something my father used to say," Daniel said slowly. "He used to say that the quality of a man's life is mostly determined by the quality of his attention. What you pay attention to. What you choose to notice." "Smart man," Gerald said. "He was," Daniel agreed. That summer, Daniel's granddaughter came to visit on a Friday as usual. She was 7 now, at the age where everything is still genuinely astonishing, where a caterpillar on a leaf is worthy of the same focused wonder as a sunset. They sat on the back porch together after lunch, the two of them, watching the yard. "Grandpa," she said, at one point, with the particular seriousness of 7-year-olds. "Yes," he said. "What do you do at your job?" He thought about it for a moment. Genuinely. The way he thought about most things. "I try to make sure that people feel like they matter," he said, "and that the work we do together is worth doing well." She considered this with great seriousness. "That sounds important," she concluded. "It is," he said. She leaned against him the way small children lean against people they trust completely, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there together in the warm afternoon light, watching a robin pick its way carefully across the lawn. There is a kind of life that doesn't make the news. It doesn't generate dramatic headlines or viral moments. It doesn't arrive with a trumpet fanfare or a spotlight. It moves quietly, at a human pace, through ordinary Tuesdays and grey November skies and pot roast dinners and Friday afternoons and long drives home in the early spring dusk. It is a life built from the daily choice to show up with integrity, to treat the person in front of you as though they matter, because they do, to carry yourself through difficulty without allowing difficulty to change who you fundamentally are, to remain, through every season of change and loss and unexpected beginning, recognizably yourself. Daniel Mercer was not a remarkable man in the way that word is usually applied. He was something quieter than that. Something more durable. He was a good man who had lived his life with care. And in the end, that was not a small thing. It was, perhaps, the most important thing of all. Some stories don't end with justice delivered dramatically at just the right moment. Some stories don't end with a villain finally understanding what they did wrong, or a moment of triumphant reversal perfectly timed for maximum effect. Some stories end simply with a man sitting on a back porch in summer, his granddaughter leaning warm against his side, watching a bird move quietly across a green lawn. And the man is at peace. And that is everything.